Hello, everyone, and welcome to Rock and Sand by Archpriest Josiah Trenum. We're going to be working on Chapter 8 today, the Catholic Counter-Reformation. And I'll start here with a little introductory section. The upheaval and unrest took place within the Latin Church and provoked what is sometimes called a Counter-Reformation, or more often than not these days, a Catholic Reformation. So, defining the Catholic Counter-Reformation, I think for me, the two main points are Catholics trying to reform and change aspects of the church and root out corruption, and the second part being countering and fighting the Reformation. And I think those are the two main points of, I think, the chapter and the Catholic Counter-Reformation that are important.
I think that's a good point to lead with, because in many ways it's very historical context that you're going to read in this chapter are people and what they were doing and what kind of rank they are. And so it can get a little confusing on what's the purpose of spelling out these people and what they do, but I think it makes sense because these are the key people that are contenders with the change that was trying to be done within the Catholic Church at that time.
And in this chapter, there are sections on different popes, their reform efforts, that kind of thing, just the history of the popes during this time period. We're not going to get into the weeds on that. Also goes into things like the Council of Trent and different theological stances, that kind of thing. That as well, we're not going to get into good content, but I think we just don't want to get down too much into detail on those things. The next section I'm going to read is on the Jesuits. Several new religious orders were founded in the 1520s, including the Capuchins. These orders are considered to be the first organic sign of the internal Catholic Reformation. In 1540, the Catholic saint Ignatius of Loyola founded the Jesuit order, known formally as the Society of Jesus, and this order became the beacon of the Counter-Reformation. The influence of the Jesuits was more poignantly felt through their universities, most poignantly. Both the Roman College, Gregorianum, and the German and English colleges in Rome. More than 500 colleges were established and staffed by the Jesuits in the first century of the order's existence. The educated Jesuits sought to revive the Roman Catholic Church and thoroughly catechize its flock against the Protestant movement. Ignatius wrote a manual, The Spiritual Exercises, which was to provide guidance in the spiritual life for the Jesuits, as well as a tract entitled Rules for Thinking with the Church, designed to counter anti-ecclesiastical and individualistic Protestantism. Early figures in the Jesuit order included, besides Ignatius Loyola, the Catholic saints Francis Xavier and Robert Bellarmine. The Jesuits were intense missionaries, and many of them, after being educated in Rome, returned to Protestant lands to preach Catholicism, a fair number of them suffering martyrdom. If one visits the Tower of London on a tour, it is possible still to see the wall etchings of imprisoned Jesuit priests from the 16th and 17th centuries. Besides the 16th century monastic orders, there were also esteemed Roman Catholic churchmen like Charles Borromeo, 1538 to 1584, Archbishop of Milan, and Francis de Sales, 1567 to 1622, Bishop of Geneva, who himself won many Calvinists back to Catholicism. Both of these were later canonized. And the Jesuits, they're interesting group of people. There have been conspiracy theories about them, and I think there's also the belief probably among at least some Catholics, maybe many Catholics, I'm not sure, that the Jesuits have become corrupted over time. And their educational, what's the right term? Educational influence carries on to this day in terms of, I think, important people being educated by Jesuits and Jesuit schools of higher learning. So those are some interesting things of note.
In this section, I found it very interesting how, in 1520, they were founded. Not even 20-some years later, it seemed to be very strong and prevalent in the culture at the time, and how, they definitely were very intentional on how they approach education and how to, as it says, revive the Catholic Church. So it's interesting how that happens. Is like, within 20 years, they could do a lot, and it kept growing. So yeah, I thought that was kind of different.
This next section here is, when did the Counter-Reformation end? This is a question not easily answered. At the time of the Reformation, the continued existence of Protestantism was not at all certain. In 1590, about half of Europe was under the control of Protestant government or culture. By 1690, only a fifth was. The Counter-Reformation appeared massively victorious. The religious conflict between Catholicism and Protestantism flared up in the 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648, and left Christian Europe blood-soaked and exhausted by religious conflicts. It gave way to centuries of Catholic-Protestant Cold War, in which each of these Western communions has failed to maintain the theological discipline of their own confessions, and have fallen prey to many heresies, from theological liberalism/secularism to liberation theology. Catholic-Protestant relations have morphed yet again since Vatican II, 1962 to 1965, when the Catholic Church refashioned its ecclesiology to find a place for Protestantism, and adopted, at least in practice, many things that the Protestants of the 16th century were calling for. Today, especially in the West, the divide between Catholicism and Protestantism is thinner than ever. The traditional Tridentine Mass is virtually non-existent, and the Catholic services have been radically Protestantized, degraded, and denuded of their traditional liturgical, aesthetic, and linguistic grandeur. Centuries of traditional Gregorian chant and ecclesiastical architecture have often given way to banjos and guitars and architectural monstrosities, all of which bear witness to a radical break from tradition. The teaching on penance, so emphasized at the Council of Trent, has vanished together with long confessional lines and numerous priests. Now in the local Catholic diocese here in the Inland Empire, Riverside-San Bernardino-Ontario, California, there are 5,000 parishioners for every priest, and so few Catholics confessing their sins and living a normal sacramental life that there is often but one published confessional hour per week. Monasteries have closed throughout the West, and there has been a reduction in the number of Roman Catholic monks, nuns, and members of religious orders in our land by some 95%. Parochial schools, which were educating some 6 million children before Vatican II, are now educating about 25% that number. New alignments have come into existence in recent decades, in which the Catholic Church has engaged in extensive dialogue with Judaism and Islam, and set its polemic sights upon the rising secularism permeating the West and leaving traditional Christian Europe faithless. The recent popes have called for a re-evangelization of Europe and have emphasized a new rapprochement with the Orthodox East, with whom they claim to share so much affinity in a common battle against the tenets of postmodernity and secularist mores.
A lot of transition, and I think I understand why they're saying the Counter-Reformation seems to not have a clear end or cut off, because there's a lot of areas where they were successful here, but then they seem to tear off, and then they kind of restarted some areas where they're trying to revamp and refashion the direction of how they want to reach people and engage people, and it teared off again. And so it appears that even though there is no clear, cutoff point, it does seem that they did see side effects of just interest in kind of people trying to figure out what the truth is and where do they stand. I also found it interesting that it is very much true that the kind of European culture has a very rise of secularism in it, and it can appear to be faithless. And I think that's may this is just me kind of speculating, maybe because there's a lot of divide, and so it's like, hey, which one do I want to prioritize over the other, and is it even relevant? And so I think a lot of people are asking these tough questions in that culture of like, what's relevant to me and what's going to help me succeed.
So we come here to the end of the chapter, and I'm going to read this last section here, and then we'll make our final remarks. The contemporary Counter-Reformation. One might be led to believe that the Counter-Reformation has ceased to exist, but the Vatican has recently announced a major new initiative designed to reconcile Protestants to its fold. In the previous chapter on the Church of England, it was noted that the Anglican Communion has been fracturing between its extreme secularism in England and America, and its more evangelical churches in Africa and elsewhere, who aggressively protest the ordination of women and the legitimization of homosexuality. Recently, Cardinal William Levada, the former Archbishop of San Francisco and the current head of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith in Rome, announced in a press conference in London, where he was meeting with Rowan Williams, then Archbishop of Canterbury for the Anglican Communion, that a special canonical structure has been established by Pope Benedict XVI that would assist the members of the Anglican Communion in becoming Roman Catholics, while maintaining the distinctive Anglican spiritual and liturgical patrimony. Not only will elements of Anglican liturgical practice be preserved, but married priests retained and special unmarried bishops commissioned as archpastors. This is a bold move which expresses a certain abandonment of confidence on the part of the papacy in traditional ecumenical dialogue with the Anglican churches. Cardinal Levada, in his announcement, articulated that the creation of a permanent Anglican structure within the Roman Catholic Church was established in response to the, quote, many requests directed to the Pope by disaffected Anglicans, which he said was a, quote, worldwide phenomenon. Perhaps the Counter-Reformation continues in some fashion yet today.
Wow. A lot of this is new to me, guys. History and learning about the ins and outs of the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation and these people. And so it's interesting to see that like doctrine changes and how these key leaders are looking at, okay, I need to make a move on what I believe and how do I influence the system that's already at play. And you can kind of see these transitional periods between the popes and between leaders. And it's interesting to see that the intentionality behind the Anglican churches at that time.
So that's going to conclude our comments on this chapter on the Catholic Counter-Reformation. And I'd like to thank everyone for listening, and please subscribe to get more content like this.